Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving straight into the foundational ideas presented in the book Perverting Our Reproductive Nature, focusing specifically on Chapter 1, Birth Control and Hormonal Contraceptives. We're going to unpack the author's core argument here, which is that the widespread introduction of hormonal birth control was actually the very first major societal experiment in perverting our reproductive design. We'll trace the historical roots, look at the biological impacts, and finally, examine the vast societal fallout that the author traces right back to this single medical advancement.
Imagine asking one simple, seemingly liberating question: what if we could separate sex from consequence? The author points out that this single question fundamentally shifted human history. You see, for almost all of human existence, intimacy and the potential for new life were biologically inseparable. The consequence was literally just part of the design. But as the book argues, by asking this question, society began treating pregnancy not as a natural, expected outcome of a relationship, but as a controllable variable. This wasn't just a medical shift. It was a profound psychological and cultural turning point, and one that likely shapes how every single one of us views relationships today.
So let's look at the historical roots of all this, a major medical shift. You know, the text makes a really interesting argument here. The sexual revolution didn't actually kick off with some widespread cultural rebellion. It began with a medical prescription. Tracking the intellectual climate of the early 20th century, the book impartially maps out how early contraception advocacy was deeply intertwined with eugenics logic. The early 1900s were a time of huge scientific optimism, where a lot of people believed human reproduction could be managed and improved. The author traces this all the way from early progressive reform movements right through the activism of Margaret Sanger in the 1920s and culminating in the FDA's approval of the very first oral contraceptive pill in 1960.
Take a look at this specific quote from Margaret Sanger back in 1922. The author highlights this to really illustrate the underlying philosophy of the era. Whatever the broader intentions might have been later on regarding women's liberation, early contraception was promoted within a framework that treated human fertility as a variable to be regulated and optimized for society's benefit. The book notes that the goal within this specific historical logic wasn't merely empowerment, it was optimization, deciding which lives were welcomed and which were prevented.
Okay, moving on to altering the natural rhythm, how biology was interrupted. Let's zoom in on the biological level for a second, because this builds into a massive structural shift. When the pill was approved in 1960, it didn't just block pregnancy, it fundamentally interrupted the natural rhythms of the human body. According to the text, the pill chemically interrupts nature's rhythm by literally overriding the female endocrine system. And it doesn't just stop ovulation. The author points to studies suggesting that altering these hormonal rhythms can influence emotional regulation, stress responses, and get this, even mate preference, potentially changing who women are naturally attracted to by suppressing cyclical attraction shifts. On top of that, while it doesn't eliminate bonding hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin, it completely modifies the biological context in which that bonding actually occurs. So what does this all mean? Well, the crucial point is that by chemically suppressing fertility, our deep psychological relationship to intimacy was fundamentally rewritten. The pill changed expectations in the mind just as much as it changed biology. When reproduction becomes suppressible with high reliability, the act of sex is entirely decoupled from its embedded narrative of potential life. It moves from being an act of inherent potential to something recreational and negotiable.
And that brings us to a major shift in responsibility and entirely altered expectations. This biological interruption didn't just stay in the body, it quickly rippled out into our relational dynamics. Just look at the shift in relational architecture here. Before the pill, intimacy carried a shared unavoidable risk. That shared possibility of pregnancy created a very real structural incentive for commitment and marriage before sex. But post-pill? The burden of prevention became totally individualized, mostly falling on women to manage prescriptions and side effects. Responsibility just became a medical procedure, and as a result, long-term commitment suddenly appeared optional rather than essential.
The book posits something fascinating here. Because women largely bore the chemical burden of suppression, male accountability was significantly recalibrated. Think about it. If pregnancy is viewed as something that is entirely preventable through technology, then it happening starts to be seen as an error, a failure of timing or compliance. The author notes that this made it structurally easier to view an unexpected pregnancy as a malfunction to be managed, rather than a shared duty to be embraced. Now let's look at the societal fallout and the demographic proof behind it. These micro-level relational shifts resulted in massive macro-level demographic changes. The author correlates the severing of sex from consequence with a staggering jump in out-of-wedlock births across the United States. In 1960, the rate was just 5%.
Fast forward to today, it's sitting at over 40%. Now, the text is careful to note that cultural revolutions are complex, and the pill wasn't the sole cause. But it strongly argues that when marriage ceased to be the assumed precondition for intimacy, the foundational structure of the family began to dramatically shift. At the exact same time, we see a massive shift in the timeline of commitment. While the average age of first sexual intercourse has stayed pretty steady around 17 since the 1960s, the age of first marriage has been delayed by nearly a decade for both men and women. Think about what that gap creates. As the author observes, it leads to a lengthened, totally unanchored adolescence. When intimacy is widely accessible without the requirement of responsibility, the transition into mature adulthood and family formation can easily just stall out. Ultimately, the book argues that this technological convenience did not exactly lead to the flourishing that was promised. Instead, we're seeing profound societal fragmentation. We traded natural rhythms for convenience, and the results, according to the author, are increased relational instability, falling birth rates that threaten the sustainability of civilizations, rising isolation, and a really deep loss of generational meaning. To really capture the sheer magnitude of this historical shift, the author cites clinical psychologist Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, who compared the pill to a social atomic bomb, stating it was literally more revolutionary than the printing press. It fundamentally changed the rules governing human sexual behavior, sparking this grand experiment whose consequences we are only just beginning to truly measure. The author expands on Dr. Peterson's atomic bomb analogy with a specific observation, and it's a powerful metaphor. An explosion causes instant devastation, right? But the deeper damage is the radiation that seeps in unseen over time. The introduction of the pill was incredibly quiet. It happened at pharmacy counters. But its fallout, the invisible reshaping of courtship, marriage, hormonal bonding, and family continuity, has slowly eroded foundational human institutions piece by piece over the last 6 decades. Which leads us to setting the stage for disruption, the very first domino. This first chapter lays the essential foundation for the entire book. It shows us how bending something away from its original intent simply became the new normal. By making autonomy the absolute priority, the author argues we made a Faustian bargain. This initial separation set the stage for all the modern fractures the book explores in later chapters, things like the digital sedation of pornography, dating apps, and artificial reproduction. It all started right here. The author leaves us with a profound question to ponder as we wrap up. What if nature was not the enemy to be outsmarted? What if it was actually showing us something intentional? As you consider how this historical shift impacts your own views on relationships and design, remember you can dive deeper into these ideas through the interactive companion site at pervertingourreproductivenature.com and support the author there. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.